Chapter 4. Elizabeth meets Mr. Wickham. When later that morning, Lydia suggested walking to Meryton to see some of the officers, all her sisters except Mary agreed to accompany her. Even Mr. Collins went with them, encouraged by Mr. Bennet, who was by now most anxious to have some time to himself. During their walk, the girls listened politely to Mr. Collins' self-important speeches. But as soon as they entered Meryton, the younger ones no longer even pretended to be interested in his conversation, but looked eagerly around in search of the officers. Just then, all the young ladies noticed a very gentlemanlike young man whom they'd never seen before, walking down the street with an officer they knew. They were all wondering who the handsome stranger could be, when the officer came up to them to greet them. He asked permission to introduce his friend, whose name was Mr. Wickham, and who had apparently arrived recently from London to become an officer in the regiment. This was exactly as it should be, because the young man only needed an officer's uniform to become completely charming. He was very good-looking, with a very pleasant, sociable manner, and after the introductions, conversation flowed most enjoyably in the little group. They were still standing and talking happily together when they heard the sound of horses and saw Darcy and Bingley riding down the street. The two gentlemen came straight towards the ladies to greet them. Bingley was clearly most interested in Jane Bennet and started talking particularly to her. Darcy, however, was just determining not to look at Elizabeth when he suddenly noticed the stranger. By chance, Elizabeth saw Darcy's and Wickham's faces at the moment when they caught sight of each other, and she was astonished at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour, one white, the other red. After a few moments, Mr. Wickham touched his hat, and Mr. Darcy nodded very slightly. What could this mean? It was impossible to imagine, and it was impossible not to wish to know. In another moment, Mr. Bingley, who did not seem to have noticed what had happened, said goodbye and rode away with Mr. Darcy. The two officers accompanied the young ladies to Mrs. Phillips's house, but did not go in spite of Lydia's repeated invitations. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and welcomed Mr. Collins most politely when he was introduced to her. She did not, however, have any more information for the girls about the agreeable Mr. Wickham. "But I tell you what, my dears," she said brightly, "I'm giving a little supper party for some of the officers tomorrow. I'll ask Mr. Phillips to visit Mr. Wickham and invite him to come too. Will you all come as well?" The girls were delighted and agreed at once to this arrangement, and the whole group walked back to Longbourn, happily discussing the enjoyable evening they were going to have. Mr. Collins had been very impressed with Mrs. Phillips's politeness, and when they reached Longbourn, he complimented Mrs. Bennet on her sister's elegance and charming manners. The next evening, the carriage took him and his 5 cousins to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the hall, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was at that moment in the house. When Mr. Collins was shown into the sitting-room and had time to look around and admire it, he said immediately to Mrs. Phillips, "Madam, I must compliment you on the size and furniture of this room. Really, I could almost imagine myself in the smaller summer breakfast room at Rosings." This remark did not at first please his hostess very much, but when she heard from him what Rosings was, and who its owner was, and how much Lady Catherine's furniture cost, she realised what a great compliment it was. During the evening, Mr. Collins found Mrs. Phillips a kind and attentive listener, which was fortunate, as the Bennet girls could not bring themselves to listen to him any longer. All the ladies were impatient to see Mr. Wickham, and when he came into the room, he appeared far more charming and gentlemanly than any of the officers present. He was the lucky man towards whom almost every female eye turned, and Elizabeth was the lucky woman beside whom he finally took his seat. His pleasant way of making conversation made her feel that he could talk interestingly about anything. As he did not play cards, which some of the party were doing, he stayed talking to Elizabeth for a large part of the evening. She hoped he would tell her how he knew Mr. Darcy, but she dared not mention that gentleman. Luckily, however, Mr. Wickham himself began to talk about it, although in a rather hesitating manner. Netherfield is quite near Meryton, I suppose. How long has Mr. Darcy been staying there?"